Just a couple of housekeeping and important points and reminders that I want to review prior to getting started with the information session. Food for thought sessions are scheduled between 12 and 1 p.m., but please feel free to come and go as needed. You do not have to stay for the entire time. That is not a requirement. All questions must be submitted ahead of time. We will not be having live chat Q&A, but I do have some questions that were submitted ahead of time that I will be reviewing today. All information sessions are recorded and will be available on the ESA website on our videos page within about 48 hours of the recording taking place. So those will be there for your reference at any time. Please remember to remain muted throughout the presentation. Your camera may be on or off, whatever your preference is. So here's our agenda for today. As I mentioned, today's topic is the Parent and Provider Handbook. So first, I'm going to go through a general handbook overview. I'm going to review some important features of our handbooks. Then I'm going to cover a few topics in the Parent Handbook and Provider Handbook. And then I will address some questions that were provided to us ahead of time. Both handbooks can be found on the resources page of the ESA website. So when you visit our website at tos.in.gov, you will land on our main website, our main web page. If you click over to our resources page, you can see both of our handbooks there. In addition to that, the Parent Handbook will be found on the Families page, and the Provider Handbook can also be found on the Provider page or the Qualified Schools page. But that Provider Handbook will be the same on both of those pages. That's where everybody can access our handbooks. A couple of things to note about the cover page here. You'll see that the cover page is going to indicate the current school year that the handbook is referencing, which is indicated by this arrow here. And then down at the bottom, there's also a current as date. So that will indicate if there's any updates made to the handbook throughout that school year. So you can see, for example, the Provider Handbook was last updated the beginning of September. Handbooks are going to be updated on an annual basis or as needed if there is a major change to any information administratively with the ESA program. If there is a change made within a school year to a parent or provider handbook, current ESA participants will receive email notification of what that update is, so they can go and reference that handbook and check for any of those updates. I anticipate that that would be sent out in our newsletter as well as an email. So something that's pretty neat about our table of contents is that it's actually an interactive page. So when you see the chapters and all of the subcategories of information that are included in that chapter, those are all links directly to the section that you choose to click. In addition, you could also click the page number and it will bring you there as well. This helps for handbooks to really be used as a reference booklet instead of something that anybody would have to read through or find that section. If you find the section, you read it, and then you decide you want to go somewhere else, you can always navigate back to the table of contents and then click on any one of these links to go to a section you're looking for. Some important features that I wanted to mention about the handbooks. So not only is the table of contents links, but the handbook itself, or handbooks, I should say, are embedded with links throughout the entire handbook. And those links will lead you to our website pages and relevant documentation that we might be referencing in the handbook. Each handbook also includes ESA program contact information, including our ESA email address and our ESA phone number. Important terms and definitions are highlighted throughout each of the handbooks for ease of access. So it's very easy to see when there is a definition of an important term, and I will demonstrate that when I go through the handbooks. In addition to these highlighted definitions, there are also short video clips that are scattered throughout each of the handbooks that are relevant to the topic or the content of that chapter. And those video clips can also be accessed on the ESA resources page outside of the handbook. So you don't necessarily need to be in the handbook to access those video clips. On average, they're about 4 minutes, so they're very easily consumable, and the content of those videos is very focused, so you can just kind of watch whatever it is that you're looking for. So here's an example of one of the first pages of our parent handbook, just to demonstrate here that there's a couple links provided throughout. These happen to be some links to our social media platforms. There's also a link directly to the provider page, the families page, and to join our mailing list to receive our monthly newsletter. I also wanted to demonstrate down here, here's a link directly to our website, as well as our ESA staff email, phone number and email address. Here's an example of one of those highlighted definitions that I was referencing earlier. So you'll see here for the parent handbook, we have some bright pink text to delineate who's an eligible student. This definition here comes directly from the Education Scholarship Account Program statute, and there's some Indiana code that's referenced throughout. So this will give you a very clear description, for example, of who an eligible student would be. And the format looks the same for any definition in either of the handbooks. Here's an image of the video clip that I was referencing earlier. So you can either click on the video itself or click down here where that link is to bring you right to the YouTube channel. We have an ESA informational YouTube channel that has the entire series of the Let's Talk with Jackie Guglielmo, all about the Education Scholarship Account Program. Now, anytime I mention these videos, I also like to ask our ESA families and our ESA providers if there's information that you're looking for that you don't see in a video. Please go ahead and call or email us and let us know of that topic or particular content area that you'd like to see more information on, because we're happy to continue to grow this series based on feedback from our participants. So let's get to the parent guardian handbook. So again, here's the school year that it's referencing and the current as date down at the bottom. I pulled a couple of topics here that I thought I would mention today. Chapter 2 is student eligibility. Chapter 4 are different qualified expenses. So these are things that families would be able to use ESA funds to pay for. Chapter 5 is all about the class wallet virtual account. So setting that account up and how payments are made. Chapter 6 is really a reiteration of the signed parent agreement from the application. So that's going to lay out all expectations, requirements, and guidelines of the program. And Chapter 8 takes a bit of a deeper dive into the process of making a payment once an invoice is provided to a family utilizing the class wallet account system. So let's go ahead and go there. So this is a link to our parent guardian handbook, which again can be found directly on our website in a few places. We're going to start with chapter 2. So I'm going to navigate here over to the table of contents, and I want to specifically know who is an eligible student. So I'm going to go ahead and click there. You can see my mouse has turned into a little finger indicating that this is a link, regardless of whether I'm over here by the number or I'm over here by the content area. And it brings me right to the exact page of the content that I'm looking for. So for the 22-23 school year, the definition of an eligible student is a student who has legal settlement in Indiana, is at least 5 years of age and less than 22 as of August 1st of the upcoming school year, is a student with a disability at the time the account is established, for whom an IEP, a service plan, or a CSEP has been developed, and the family needed to meet our annual income qualification. So again, here, When I hover over the video clip, my mouse turns into a hand, which means this is a link, or I can click down here to access the 4-minute clip, and a different tab would open that would take me to YouTube. Now, one of the really important parts about this section is not only does it give the definition of an eligible student, but if any families are on the call right now or are watching the video and remember going through the application process, you'll remember that there was some documentation that needed to be produced in order to prove these eligibility requirements. And we go ahead and expand on all of that down here. So it's organized by requirement. So I won't go through them all very thoroughly in the interest of time. But for example, to prove residency, here's the definition of legal settlement, and then a couple of examples of things that could be provided. Here's our age requirement, and we mentioned that age is verified by a valid birth certificate. And again, we go ahead for disability and special education requirements. We go ahead and mention what those documentation examples are that could be uploaded to prove that eligibility requirement. So that's all outlined here. Perhaps the most complicated was the income requirement because it has two components. One is the actual household income, and the other is household size. So we talk at length about each of these. So providing guidance on how to determine your household size, who can be included when calculating your household size, and then again, which categories of income can be included when determining household income. So this is a really good area for families to check, especially going into next year. If the student eligibility were to change, you would see this information here, in addition to the documentation that we would be expecting for families to produce to prove eligibility for the program. So next we wanted to take a look at Chapter 4, which is qualified expenses. So I'm going to use my bar over here to navigate back up to the table of contents and scroll down to Chapter 4, qualified expenses. So here at the top, you'll see that we talk a little bit about what a qualified expense is in the Education Scholarship Account Program. There's a brief list here of the different types of expenses, in addition to another one of these Let's Talk series clips of qualified expenses. We then, just like we did for eligibility, take a bit of a deeper dive into what the different types of qualified expenses are. So specifically tuition and fees, what can be included in tuition and fees, what particular fees are excluded, and how a student can be charged for tuition. And then we continue to do the same for each category of qualified expense that's allowable under the Education Scholarship Account Program. Now, it's important to remember two items here that we talk about are services and therapies and virtual services. So services should be linked directly to the student's IEP, service plan, or CSEP that they uploaded. We're going to be referencing those documents to see which services and therapies were recommended. In addition, families can always submit a prescription from a treating physician if that particular service or therapy was not included in the IEP or service plan, but the treating physician and the family think that it would be helpful to the student's educational and academic progress. Once that prescription is uploaded, it then becomes a qualified expense for that student. It's also very important for providers and families alike to understand which services may be accessed virtually and paid for with ESA funds and which must be in person. So at this time, any educational services for a student who's a student with a disability may be virtual. So that would include things like tutoring, and occupational therapy can also be virtual. However, other types of therapy at this time must be in person. Also included in this section, because we're talking about expenses, is a little bit more about financial aid and scholarship granting organizations, which parents would typically come in contact with if they're enrolled their student in a non-public school. There's also some guidance here that parents and providers alike might think is important about using Medicaid or other insurance payments in conjunction with ESA, which is a wonderful part of our program, that families may still use Medicaid and insurance to pay for expenses prior to using ESA. So parents don't have to choose between one or the other, they may use both. Another important note under qualified expenses is that the ESA program may not provide a fee structure for these services and therapies that are education related. That really needs to come from the provider. So the ESA would never advertise prices or costs for anything. Families would need to reach out to the provider for that information. So next we wanted to go to chapter 5, which is ClassWallet virtual account. And because it's the next chapter, I'll just go ahead and scroll down here. So shortly after being approved, a family or a provider will receive an email directly from ClassWallet, which is a platform that we use for account management. And that provider or the family would be asked to establish their account with ClassWallet. So a login and a username. Now, families are setting up a ClassWallet purse. And that purse is where the quarterly distributions of the scholarship award are going to be dispersed into. So whatever the total grant award amount is, families will see 4 quarterly disbursements that are deposited into the purse. And can be used until the end of the school year. Families can also roll over up to $1,000 into the next school year without impacting future quarterly disbursements or account totals. So that's a nice feature there, and that is all through the ClassWallet platform. ClassWallet has some pretty robust customer service. So they have chat, they have some video kind of self-help for those who are feeling brave and tech savvy. But there's also chat and phone number and an email if anybody is having any difficulty with logging in or seeing their ClassWallet balance. We provide some guidance in this section for when a provider or a family member should be reaching out to ClassWallet versus when it would be appropriate to reach back out to ESA staff if you're having some trouble with your account. We then talk a little bit about the payment process. Most notably that expenses can only be paid for after services are rendered. So whether that's educational services or therapies, those services need to occur first, including tuition and fees, unless it's to a qualified school, which is a state accredited non-public school who administers the statewide assessment. They're the only type of entity that may bill an invoice for services prior to services being rendered. Once a family receives an invoice, they're going to upload it into the ClassWallet system. So if that's sent to them via PDF, that's pretty simple. If they have a hard copy, you can take a photo of that invoice and upload the photo into ClassWallet. Then it comes to our team for review and then direct deposit payment into the provider's account. We talk a little bit about refunds here, as well as the quarterly payment procedure. So you'll see here are all the dates of our quarterly disbursement. We have another one coming up January 1. And those are 4 equal quarterly disbursements amount. So 25% is going to go into the student's purse each quarter. There are some circumstances where we may be required to freeze a student account, which means that the family would still have the ability to access what their current balance is, see any outstanding invoices and any invoices that have been paid. But when an account is frozen, no invoices or payments may be initiated. And if this was the case, if we ever needed to freeze a student account, we would make email notification to the email that we have on file for a parent or guardian. So that's a really great section to review with regard to ClassWallet and the process of onboarding with them. Next is expectations, requirements, and guidelines of the program. So we'll hop on down to chapter 6. Oops, skipped right by it. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a reiteration of the agreement that was signed at the time of approval or just shortly before approval at the time of application for a parent. It outlines annual renewal for a student that's currently utilizing the Education Scholarship Account Program and would like to renew for next year. The parent's responsibility to notify us if they no longer meet any eligibility requirements. A little bit about student test number and the importance of that student test number if a student's educating at home. The required areas of study per the ESA statute. A bit of information about the statewide assessment. An important note that graduation or the obtaining of a certificate of completion for a student is a terminating event for the account, and any other reasons that an ESA account may be terminated. And we outline those here. We then go into a little bit of the process of freezing the account with the intent to terminate. So if the account is frozen with the intent to terminate the account for any of the aforementioned reasons, the parent will get notification that this is the action that we've been required to take and the reason that we've been required to take it. Parents then have the ability to petition that decision and must do so within 30 days. The treasurer of state may then review the petition and provide a redetermination to the parent. So this paragraph here is going to outline that process for any family who may receive a notification of freeze to terminate. We also talk here a bit about disputes provided, about services provided to students and the relationship between the provider and the family, and the capabilities of our online portal. So that's the section about guidelines and requirements. Moving on to the final chapter, which is chapter 8, making a payment. So of course, this is not the final chapter of the parent handbook, but just the last one I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to use my navigation here to go to chapter 8, making a payment. So you'll see here, we take a much closer view of the payment process. And just to reiterate, I'm in the parent handbook right now, but a lot of this information is reviewed over in the provider handbook. I might not talk about it today because I didn't want to be duplicative, but please know, providers, that you will also have this information over in the provider handbook as well. So you'll see here, there's a graphic about the payment process starting from the student beginning services with the participating entity all the way to the participating entity providing a receipt of payment after the funds have settled into the provider's account. We have a bit of information here about the parent's responsibility with regard to invoicing, and anybody that submitted an invoice with us may be familiar with this process. And we talk about the different components that we review for in order to approve an invoice for payment. Now, some of these are optional. So we don't require an STN on every invoice because not every provider would need to have the STN. In addition, a payment due date is not always required on the invoice. However, all the rest of the components are required components. Anytime an invoice is rejected by one of our account specialists, the family will get an email clearly stating which components of the invoice were missing, and the opportunity for the family to re-upload that invoice once they've touched base with the provider and gotten that invoice corrected. Then we go into some specifics here about tuition and fees at a qualified school, because as I referenced earlier, that payment process is a little bit different because qualified schools, which again are state accredited non-public schools who administer the statewide assessment, are able to invoice prior to services rendered. So that's going to look a little bit different. For families that want to use the ESA program, but do not, and are enrolling their student in a qualified school, but do not necessarily want to use the ESA funds to pay for the tuition and fees at that qualified school, perhaps they have other means of payment for that, they can submit a ticket to our customer support portal for a waiver, so that we know that even though they're enrolled in that school, that they will not be using their ESA funds for payment there, and that they want to reserve their ESA funds for other types of qualified expenses. So that wraps up our parent handbook. I would like to move on to our provider handbook. There are a couple of chapters here that I wanted to pull out and talk specifically about. Again, providers, there will be all of that information that I just went through in the parent handbook. I just didn't want to mention it twice in the webinar today, but you will have access to that information in your provider handbook as well. So let's start off with chapter 2, which is eligibility. Now here, we're not talking about student eligibility because this is the provider handbook. So here you'll see a definition for participating entity. So what does that mean in our program, and what types of entities, these are broad categories here, can be participating entities and apply to be approved in our program. And similar to the parent handbook, you'll see a clip here, about a 4-minute clip, give or take a minute or two, about participating entities, and you can watch that video clip here from YouTube. Now, what's interesting about the provider handbook is we've had to make sure that we embed information both about qualified schools and every other type of provider. And those are very different. So what we did for kind of ease of aesthetic here is anytime we were talking about qualified school, you'll see this little QS graphic and an outline in pink. And this means that this information is specific to a qualified school. So the first section here is defining what a qualified school is. So a provider would be able to decipher pretty quickly whether they fall into this category or not. We then go on to describe all the other types of qualified expenses and participating entities. So private tutoring, different service providers, therapists, courses or programs, and descriptions are here. Here's another example of those embedded links I was talking about. So one of our qualified expenses and our participating entities is providers that provide assessments. So here's links to information on the CLEP and a list of statewide assessments from the Department of Education. It's also important to know what the requirements are of each participating entity, because when applying, when providers apply to become a participating entity, they'll have to provide documentation as well. So this section here will take a closer look at what requirements we ask of those participating entities. And then because it's important information for an entity to have, we do go ahead and define an eligible student as well, so that a participating entity can ensure that it makes sense for them to apply because they provide services to this type of student. And I include the video there as well. Next, we'll jump to chapter 4, which is duties and obligations. So I'm going to use my navigation tool here to go right to chapter 4. So we include some information here about the services provided and the discretion of participating entities. Here we see that pink outline, so we know that these sections are specifically about qualified schools and their employees and the statewide assessment that they're obligated to provide as a qualified school. It's also the responsibility of a qualified school to notify the Treasurer of State if one of their ESA students has graduated or obtained a certificate of completion, because that will be a terminating event for that student. Back into presentation mode. The last section I wanted to reference here was status revocation and I'm sorry, I missed chapter 6, accepting payments and invoicing. So let's head back over here, go down to chapter 6, accepting payment. So here is a much thorough provider perspective on accepting payment of ESA funds through the Class Wallet portal. So what the expectation is for how long it should take, how families are navigating the system. So providers have a kind of a closer picture of that. a bit about customer support for providers. Again, a reiteration of the payment process, which I'll go through, kind of breeze over right now. It's important for providers to know ahead of time what those required components of the invoice will be. And again, STN and payment due date are optional, not required. Then we also talk specifically about invoices for transportation providers, business entities who are offering tuition and fees, quarterly payment, and that waiver process again. So a question that we got very often at the beginning of the ESA program was there a way for participating entities to initiate the request for payment through the ESA platform? And unfortunately, there is not. Participating entities can request that payment through the family and can certainly follow up with us on the status of the invoice, but they themselves cannot request the payment through Class Wallet. Here's also a bit of information for providers to know about what happens if a student's account is frozen and what the parent's responsibility during that freeze would be. And a bit more about refunds again. Okay. Last chapter is status revocation and reinstatement. So I'm going to use my bar, go up here to chapter 8, status revocation and reinstatement. So I talked earlier about the process of freezing a parent's account and potentially terminating the account if one of the program requirements or eligibility requirements is not met. It's a little bit different for providers. What they have is a status revocation. So their status as a participating entity, which by definition means they're approved to participate in the program, may be revoked, and what those conditions would be to revoke that status. There is the possibility of reinstatement of that status. And so we provide some information here to participating entities about what that reapplication process looks like. So I'm going to head over to questions right now. I do see I have one in the chat and I have no problem getting to that, but I am going to address the ones that were provided prior to the webinar first. The first question was submitted by a provider. What can be done to expand capacity in the state without providers simply hiring away staff from other providers? So this is a great question, I think, as a field. I myself am a board certified behavior analyst. I was previously a special education teacher, so I know about the struggle of finding providers. I'm really excited about the ESA program and the market that it really can create, because we're providing state tuition support funds back in the hands of families to use to customize their students' education in the way that makes most sense. So I'm anticipating that a lot more providers are going to come into this space because families now have alternate means to pay. In addition to, as I mentioned earlier, they can still use Medicaid, they can still use insurance, all those other types of financial aids, scholarship grant organization that they were previously using. And on top of that would now have the education scholarship account program. So I think it's probably a bigger question than just for today. But I do see the ESA as it has in other states. I mean, we're certainly not the first state to implement an ESA. Arizona, Florida, Texas, New Hampshire, Ohio, they're popping up all over the place. So it's really creating a free market, and a lot more providers are coming into this space. So I think that there's hope down the line where business entities may have more providers to draw from. And, you know, as a practitioner myself, I know that attrition is always a problem in the field. So I don't know that ESA will necessarily solve that, but I definitely think that, you know, people who wouldn't necessarily think about becoming providers, maybe families were using, private tutors for their student have now come on board and become participating entities and may wish to offer their services to other students around the state. So that's really promising and really exciting. And that is a choice that the providers have. By coming on board with the ESA program, you are not required to offer your services to every student that may be a good fit. And so there really is no risk to the provider for coming on board in that capacity. If you're, a provider that's fully, you're at full capacity with the number of clients that you can have, that's okay. That doesn't mean that you can't come on board with ESA and provide this as an alternate means of payment for the families that are currently accessing your services. So the ESA offers a lot of flexibility there, and it really it makes it work for families and providers alike. I also got a second question, I think from a family member, how to access other services. So I'm going to answer this in the way that I'm interpreting it. So in order to spend ESA funds for services, the provider must be an approved participating entity. And we have an approved provider list on our website, on the homepage of our website, that's updated 2 times per week as we bring new providers into the program. So if a family knows they want speech or they want tutoring or they want transportation or ABA, they can go to that approved providers list and see if the provider that they have in mind is there, or kind of shop around and see who's been approved. Likewise, we're really excited to let families know that if you have a provider in your community that you really want to use and you don't see them on the approved providers list, there's a form on our website that you can fill out that goes directly to our staff, and it gives us a bit of information about the provider that you'd like to use in your community. And then instead of putting the burden on the family to do the reach out to the provider, we go ahead and do that for you. So we'll reach out to the provider, let them know that there are families in their community that really want to use ESA funds to pay for their services, and we will give them an overview of the program and their responsibilities and all the benefits of participating. So I think that's the best way I can answer this question of how families can access services. The types of qualified expenses are clearly outlined in the handbook, and then referencing our approved provider list or letting us know if there's a provider that's not on that list is going to help us expand the number of participating entities around the state. Now, I am finished up a little bit ahead of schedule, so I will go ahead and answer some questions in the chat. I'm still not able to open this up to live Q&A, but I'm happy to answer on my end. So the first one is about eligibility. I have heard that another eligibility requirement is that a student must have exited the school to receive funding. Can you speak to that at all? Yes. So one of the requirements is that a student may not be enrolled in a public school full-time, meaning that school cannot claim tuition support for that student, because that is what our scholarship is based on. It's based on 90% of their tuition support amount based on the school corporation of their legal settlement. So this scholarship is for students who are either accessing individualized courses or programs or classes from a public school, or have completely disenrolled and are educating at home or in a private school or an ABA center or a customized kind of a la carte fusion of different things, or a micro school, or any of these wonderful new opportunities that are popping up really since the pandemic. But the one requirement is that the student cannot be full-time attending a public school. I do see another question in here. About accepting applications to become a provider. So that's a great question. The application window for families is finite, but the application period for providers is open and rolling all year. So there is never a deadline for providers to apply and come on board as a participating entity. Another question is more nuanced. Are education-based trainees covered, provided they're serving eligible students? We are seeking creative ways to create a pipeline between eligible schools and our agency to offer paid internships and/or field experiences in whatever capacities we can. So that came from Natalie. Natalie, I would encourage you to email ESA directly, and I can meet with you just to learn a little bit more about this before I go ahead and answer this question, because I certainly don't want to misspeak and want to give you the best information. My student does not attend a qualified school. Will my student have to take state mandated tests? So yes, it is a requirement of the family to ensure that their student is taking the statewide assessment. A qualified school is responsible for offering the statewide assessment to their eligible students, but for any students that are not enrolled at a qualified school, that is a requirement. We are currently working on a method for families, for ESA families who are not enrolled at a qualified school, to take the statewide assessment. We are not clear on how that will occur at this time, but we are working diligently on it and are partnering with Department of Education on that. So as soon as we have more information, that will go to anybody on our mailing list and anybody receiving our newsletter, in addition to our participating families. So I don't see any other questions in the chat, but I'll give it another minute or two. Please don't rush. Feel free to submit your question in the chat. And while anybody might be typing, I just wanted to wrap up and say thank you all for your time and attention. Please find our email here. This is our general inbox. If it's something that needs to be escalated to me, if you email this email address, it will get to me. This is also our ESA phone number. So you can call that number and get some of your questions answered, or it can be directed to anybody in our office. We also have a Facebook, a LinkedIn, an Instagram, and we have that YouTube account with some informational videos that are very helpful, very concentrated on certain topics. So please go ahead and follow us. We're always posting about different events that we're doing, different things going on with the ESA program. So that's a great way to stay up to date on that information. And I don't see any other questions that have come through. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, everybody. I wish everybody a really happy, relaxing, and safe holiday season. And like I said, if any other questions pop up, please feel free to give us an email or a call. Thank you all so much.